Payment incomplete. Step aside. The words hit the air like a slap, loud enough for the entire boarding line to hear, loud enough to make the woman behind Naomi Reeves take a small instinctive step backward, as if proximity to the problem might make her part of it. But that moment had not arrived yet. That moment was still 14 minutes away, still waiting at the end of a Tuesday afternoon in November at O'Hare International Airport, still coiled inside a gate called K-19, like something that had been building for a very long time. Before that moment, there was this one Dr. Naomi Reeves, 44 years old, rolling carry-on, gliding silently behind her blazer, buttoned against the recycled chill of Terminal 5, moving through the concourse with the particular focus of a woman who has learned to treat airports as something to be navigated rather than experienced. She wore dark tailored trousers and a cream blouse and the small diamond stud earrings she had bought herself the morning she passed the bar 20 years ago in a jewelry store on Michigan Avenue, where the saleswoman had assumed she was shopping for someone else. She had bought them anyway. She wore them to every arbitration. O'Hare in late November had a specific quality that Naomi had cataloged over years of transit: the smell of recycled air and chain restaurant coffee. The particular loneliness of a terminal at dusk when the light outside has gone gray and the fluorescent brightness inside feels like an argument against nature. The way the PA announcements bounced off the marble floors and arrived in your ears half a second after they'd already registered as background noise. She had passed through this building more times than she could count, and she had never once loved it. But she knew it the way you know a place you keep returning to against your will intimately without affection. She checked her watch. 4:09 p.m. The gate board ahead read TAA 808. London Heathrow boarding in 21 minutes. She was cutting it close, not because she had been careless, but because the emergency board call had run until 1 a.m. and she had driven herself to the airport on 3 hours of sleep and a thermos of coffee that had gone cold somewhere on the expressway, and the traffic on the 90 had added 11 minutes she did not have to spare. She had been awake for 31 hours. The Harlow Capital situation had been building for 6 weeks, a slow-motion corporate siege that Naomi had been tracking with the focused dread of someone watching a storm form on a radar screen, knowing exactly where it was going to make landfall. Harlow Capital was a private equity firm that specialized in what its own prospectus euphemistically called strategic restructuring, which meant in plain language, buying distressed assets and selling them for parts. It had set its sights on transatlantic airways 3 months ago, purchasing enough secondary stock to trigger a legal review of TAA's 2019 merger covenants. Their argument was elegant in its cynicism that TAA had breached those covenants by failing to adequately disclose known operational risks during the 2022 global fuel crisis, and that therefore the merger terms were void. The original investors were owed a settlement, and Harlow was entitled to pursue a forced restructuring. It was in Naomi's professional assessment a bad argument dressed in an expensive suit. But bad arguments made with enough money and enough confidence had a way of winning, and the arbitration panel in London was convening in less than 18 hours. And Naomi Reeves was the only person alive who knew every clause of those merger contracts intimately enough to dismantle Harlow's case from the inside out, because she had written them herself 4 years ago at a mahogany desk in TAA's Chicago headquarters, word by careful word, knowing even then that someone would eventually try to use them as a weapon. 47,000 people, Philip Adeyemi had said to her on the call last night, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had built something and was watching someone try to take it apart. Pilots, baggage handlers, gate agents, mechanics, 47,000 families. Lillian, if Harlow wins this, they won't, she had said. But call me Naomi Philip. You've known me for 12 years. He had laughed, despite everything. She had hung up and returned to her brief. Now she moved through the concourse toward K-19, her tablet tucked under her arm, her mind already 3 arguments ahead of where her body was. She passed a gate agent snapping at a family with a stroller. The agent's voice high and frayed, her neck rigid with the specific tension of someone who had been managing chaos for too long without relief. And Naomi filed the observation away without breaking stride, the way she filed everything noted, cataloged, returned to when relevant. She arrived at gate K-19 with 18 minutes to boarding. The gate was a zoo. She found a pillar, opened her tablet, and began to read. She had not always been this still. There was a version of Naomi Reeves younger earlier, full of the particular combustible energy of someone who has worked twice as hard as everyone around her and knows it, who had walked into rooms and announced herself. Not loudly, not with arrogance, but with the forward-leaning posture of someone who needed to be seen, who had learned that if you did not establish your presence in the first 30 seconds, certain people in certain rooms would spend the rest of the meeting looking past you, to the white man standing 2 feet behind you, waiting for the real authority to reveal itself. She had spent years learning to abandon that posture. Not because it was wrong, it wasn't wrong, it was survival, but because she had discovered slowly and with considerable frustration that announcing herself only gave certain people more reasons to dismiss her. So she had changed her approach. She stopped announcing. She arrived. She let the work speak. She let the silence. Before she opened her mouth, be its own kind of authority, and she had found that it was a more durable power than anything she could project with her posture or her voice. This was not, she would be quick to tell anyone who asked a lesson she had learned willingly. She thought about her mother sometimes in airports, which made sense in ways she had never fully articulated. Her mother, Gloria Reeves, had been a flight attendant for a regional airline in the late 1980s and early 1990s. A woman of extraordinary competence and unshakable composure who had applied 5 times for international routes and been passed over 5 times always for women who were younger or blonder or both, always with a different stated reason that somehow produced the same result. Gloria had never filed a complaint, had never raised her voice in a way that could be used against her, had ironed her uniform every Sunday night at the kitchen table with the same patient dignity she brought to everything she did, and had shown up Monday morning ready to do her job better than anyone else on the roster, because that was what you did when the alternatives were worse. Naomi had become a lawyer, in some part because she wanted to have the language her mother never had. The specific, documented, legally enforceable language that turned I was treated unfairly into something a room full of people in suits had to take seriously. She was 44 years old. She had been general counsel of Transatlantic Airways for 6 years, executive vice president for 2. She had argued cases in London, Hong Kong, and Frankfurt. She had deposed executives who made her annual salary in a quarterly bonus. She had on 3 separate occasions talked a TAA board in active panic off a ledge, using nothing but the force of a well-constructed argument, and the specific calm of someone who had done her homework when no one else was still in the building. She had a ritual on TAA flights, had maintained it for years, where she made small private notes about what was working and what wasn't, a gate process that was moving smoothly, a crew interaction that suggested good training, a logistical bottleneck that was creating unnecessary passenger friction, not as surveillance, as care. TAA was her company in the truest sense. She understood that word, not owned but built into, invested in the place where the best part of her professional life had been spent, and she watched it the way you watch something you are responsible for, with the mixture of pride and perpetual vigilance that responsibility produces. Today, she was not doing the ritual. Today, she had 47,000 jobs in her carry-on and 18 minutes until boarding, and a closing argument to refine, and she sat with her back to the pillar and her eyes on her tablet, and let the noise of the gate area wash past her like water around a stone. She was aware of the gate agent. You couldn't be at K-19 and not be aware of her, a woman in her late 50s with platinum blonde hair, swept into a tight chignon, reading glasses on a beaded chain. TAA badge clipped to her jacket lapel. The name Claudia printed in block letters, large enough to read from 10 feet away. Claudia Marsh was managing the gate with the energy of someone who had long since stopped finding chaos interesting and now simply wanted it to end on schedule. Her voice was sharp and carrying her gestures impatient, her attention moving from screen to passenger to line with the rapid tactical focus of someone putting out small fires. Naomi noted her, noted the tension in the gate area, the disorganization of the boarding lanes, the low-grade hostility in the air. Filed it, returned to her screen. Zone 1 was called. Then a few minutes later, Zone 2. Naomi packed her tablet, zipped her bag, and joined the end of the line. She pulled up her digital boarding pass on her phone-cracked screen at the corner from a drop last week that she hadn't gotten around to fixing, and held her passport in her other hand, and let the line move forward, and thought about force majeure clauses and the specific pleasure of watching an overconfident opposing counsel realize midway through a cross-examination that the ground had been shifting under them for the last hour and a half. The person ahead of her was waved through. Naomi stepped up. She held her phone to the scanner screen, up boarding pass, bright and clear against the glass. The machine beeped. Red light. The harsh, flat sound of a system saying no. Claudia Marsh's eyes moved from the screen to Naomi's face in a single motion, and something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, not obviously, but it was there, a barely perceptible recalibration, the eyes doing something quick and private before the face settled back into its professional flatness. It lasted less than a second. Naomi saw it. "There's a flag on your ticket," Claudia said, her fingers already moving to the keyboard. "Payment incomplete. You'll need to step aside." Naomi kept her voice level, and even the same voice she used in depositions when she wanted to establish a baseline before the actual work began. "Can you give me the specific flag code?" This ticket was booked by TA. A corporate, it should be on the CEO's account. I can call the internal verification line myself if that's faster. "I know the number," Claudia typed without looking up. "The system says payment incomplete. That's all I can tell you. You'll need to step aside and let the rest of the line board. I understand the flag." Naomi said, still patient, still measured, but making no move toward the side area. "What I'm saying is that there's a verification protocol for exactly this situation, a 60-second call to the TAA corporate desk that will confirm the booking. I'm happy to do it right now, or you can do it, but the ticket is valid and I'm a confirmed passenger." Claudia looked up from her screen. She looked at Naomi with the particular expression of someone who has decided in a way that is no longer fully conscious that patience has a shorter half-life for some people than others. "I don't have time for this," she said, and her voice had shifted louder now, with a carrying quality that seemed designed less for communication and more for audience. "The system says you didn't pay. I have a full flight to board. Step aside. My name is Dr. Naomi Reeves." Naomi said, her voice dropping slightly the way it did when she wanted to signal that she was moving from conversational to formal. "I'm the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of this airline, and I am on company-critical business that cannot be delayed. The flag on my ticket is a standard automated alert for high-value executive bookings. The protocol is a verification call, not a security escalation. I am asking you to make that call." Claudia stared at her for a moment. Then, remarkably, she laughed a short dismissive sound and looked past Naomi at the line behind her. "General Counsel," she repeated with the specific intonation of someone performing disbelief for a crowd. "Sure, sweetheart. I've heard everything." She raised her voice to the gate area. "I need security at K-19. Passenger refusing to clear the boarding lane, claiming to be a TAA employee." The words landed in the air like something thrown. Naomi felt the heat of it, not embarrassment exactly, but the hot, specific fury of being publicly accused of something false in a terminal full of strangers by an employee of the company she had given 12 years of her life to protecting. She kept her face still. She kept her posture straight. She had learned over 20 years in rooms where losing her composure would be used against her to keep the fury internal and the external surface as smooth and unreadable as a closed door. What was actually happening, though, Claudia did not know this, and would not know it until Jessica Morrow pulled the system log 7 hours later, was straightforward and documentable. The ticket had been booked the previous evening after midnight by Philip Adiemi's executive assistant on TAA's CEO corporate account. Full international fare one-way departing within 16 hours of booking. The automated fraud detection system had flagged it as a high-value anomalous booking, not because anything was wrong, but because the pattern matched the parameters the system used to identify potential account irregularities. The flag was a tool, not a verdict. The protocol was clearly printed in Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the TAA Gate Operations Manual. Upon detection of a payment irregularity, flag gate agent should contact the TAA corporate verification desk at the designated internal number. Verification typically takes 60 seconds. Upon confirmation, agent proceeds with boarding. Claudia had not opened the operations manual. She had not dialed the verification number. She had looked at the flag, looked at the face of the woman holding the phone, and in 31 seconds had moved from flag to security call without stopping at the step in between. The line behind Naomi had gone quiet. Phones had begun to rise. Officer Brett Hale arrived with the specific momentum of a man who has been waiting for something to do. He was thick-set and fair-skinned, with a dirty blonde crew cut going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that had probably been unremarkable in youth but had settled over decades into an expression of permanent authority. The face of a man who had worn a badge long enough that the badge had started wearing him. He was in his mid-40s, and he moved through crowds the way certain men move through crowds with an assumption of space that others were expected to yield. Claudia met him before he reached the podium 3 steps out. Her hand briefly on his sleeve, her voice low and urgent in a way that was meant to look like professional briefing, but had the unmistakable quality of one person loading another's perspective before the situation could be assessed independently. She spoke quickly. She used the word aggressive before Hale had even looked at Naomi. She used the phrase refuses to comply. Officer Torres arrived a half-step behind Hale, younger and quicker-eyed, already scanning the scene with the broader attention of someone who had learned from experience to take in everything before forming a conclusion. Torres looked at Claudia, looked at Naomi, looked at the boarding line frozen in a wide semicircle of spectators' phones lifting one by one like flowers opening in time-lapse. Her expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted a slight tension, a preparation. Hale stepped directly in front of Naomi with the proximity of someone who understands that physical space is its own kind of message. He was 6'2", and he used every inch of it, positioning himself so that she had to tilt her chin slightly to meet his eyes, which was almost certainly intentional. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the flat, effortful patience of someone performing reasonableness for an audience. "You need to clear the boarding area. The gate agent has asked you to step aside," Officer Naomi said, keeping her voice at the same measured register she had maintained throughout. "This is a civil matter involving a ticket verification flag that can be resolved with a single phone call. I am Dr. Naomi Reeves, and I am a TAA employee traveling on company business. I am not creating a disturbance. I am standing in a boarding line asking for a standard protocol to be followed. My identity can be verified in 30 seconds. I'm not interested in verifications." Hale said, his voice going flatter. "I'm interested in you clearing this area." "Officer Torres," Naomi said, shifting her attention deliberately. "I'd like to request that this be handled as a verification matter rather than a security matter. There has been no disturbance. There is no threat. There is a payment flag on a corporate ticket that requires a 60-second phone call." Torres opened her mouth. Hale talked over her. "Stand back," he said to his partner, not looking at her. Then to Naomi, "I'm going to ask you one more time to clear this area. Failure to comply is a public disturbance under Chicago Municipal Code." "I am a confirmed ticketed passenger," Naomi said. "You do not have probable cause to detain me. I have not raised my voice. I have not threatened anyone. I have not made physical contact with anyone. What I am telling you is accurate and verifiable, and I am asking you to verify it before this escalates further." It was the word probable cause that changed his face. She saw it happen, the shift from performed patience to something rawer, something that had stopped pretending to be about the rules and had become very plainly about the fact that she was standing in front of him and speaking to him in his own language and refusing to be moved by the weight of his uniform. His jaw tightened. Something in his eyes completed a calculation that had started the moment Claudia put her hand on his sleeve. Torres said his name. He didn't respond. "Last chance," he said to Naomi, his voice dropping in a way that was not quieter but denser, weighted with something ugly. "Move, or I move you." "You will not touch me," Naomi said clearly. Her voice was not raised. It was precise. "I am Dr. Naomi Reeves, EVP, and General Counsel of Transatlantic Airways, and I am asking for your full name and badge number before this goes any further." He moved. Torres said. Frank No said. Brett, the sound of it barely reaching Naomi's ears before Hale's hand was already there, closing around her left arm with a grip that was not a hold, but a statement. Fingers digging into her bicep through the silk of her blazer, and then the force of it, the sudden shocking physics of a much larger body redirecting a smaller one, and the wall arriving with a violence that her brain registered before her nerve endings did the textured drywall against her shoulder, against her cheekbone, the impact absorbing through her body in a single cold wave, and then Hale's forearm across her back, pinning her. The sound the crowd made was not a scream. It was an intake of breath, so unified it was almost orchestral. The sound of 50 people having the same realization at the same moment. Caleb Osei, 24 years old, standing 4 people back in the boarding line with his phone at chest height, had been filming for 87 seconds. His hands did not shake. He took one careful step to the left to clear his angle, and the camera stayed steady. Claudia Marsh at her podium had her hand pressed flat over her mouth. Her face had gone the color of old paper. This was not what she had wanted. She had wanted the problem to disappear. She had not understood until this exact moment that she was the one who had made it. "You are assaulting me," Naomi said, her voice muffled slightly by proximity to the wall but unbroken, clear, deliberate carrying to every phone in the gate area. "Officer Brett Hale. Badge number. You are on camera. State your badge number." She was not panicking. The crowd knew it. And Hale, with his forearm pressed against the back of a woman who was pinned to a wall and still speaking in complete sentences and asking for his badge number, knew it too. The jet bridge door opened and Captain Gerald Sutton stepped into the terminal with the brisk purpose of a man who had come to fix a boarding delay and found something else entirely. He was 58, silver-haired, with the particular physical quality of commercial pilots who have spent decades sitting in seats designed for competence upright, measured a face that had been trained by 30 years of crisis management to broadcast calm regardless of internal weather. He had come because the boarding gate had gone silent 7 minutes ahead of schedule, and his first officer had flagged the departure window at risk, and he expected to find a baggage conflict or an oversell situation or one of the dozen minor logistical fires that were a routine feature of international departures out of O'Hare. He did not expect what he found. Susan Park. His senior purser was 2 steps behind him, and she registered the scene in a different order than he did. She saw the crowd first, the circle of silent filming passengers, and then the gate agent frozen at her podium with her hand over her mouth, and then the officer, and then the woman pinned against the wall of the jet bridge entrance with her shoulder against the drywall and a forearm across her back, and Susan's hand went to her chest in a gesture that was entirely involuntary. Sutton's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it had the frequency of a sound that stops rooms. "What is happening here?" Hale did not release Naomi. He turned his head toward the captain with the expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-task and is weighing whether the interruption is worth acknowledging. "Captain, this is a police matter. Non-compliant passenger, possible no-fly situation. We're handling it. We'll have the gate cleared in a few minutes." "A no-fly situation," Sutton repeated, and his voice had changed not louder but harder, the word landing differently from his mouth than it had from Hale's. He looked at the woman against the wall and saw her blazer twisted at the shoulder, the red abrasion beginning to form along her cheekbone, her hands visible and open and not raised, her eyes clear and furious and tracking him with the focused intelligence of someone who was filing everything that was happening for purposes he could not yet identify. Then he looked at the floor. Her carry-on had been kicked to the side. The main compartment had come unzipped, and a laptop lay on the terminal floor beside a thick, bound document. The pages fanned slightly from the fall, the cover sheet facing upward under the fluorescent lights, and the text on it, in the high-contrast formatting of a confidential legal brief, was visible from 8 feet away. Transatlantic Airways, Office of the General Counsel. Harlow Capital. Arbitration confidential and privileged. Susan saw it at the same moment. She took a step backward without meaning to. Her hand was still at her chest, but now her expression had changed from distress into something that was the specific cold recognition of someone understanding, very late, the full weight of what has been set in motion. Sutton crossed the terminal floor in 4 steps. He stopped in front of Hale. He did not touch him. He did not raise his voice. He said in a tone that had dropped several degrees below anything that could be mistaken for warmth, "Take your hands off that woman. Now." Hale's jaw went tight. "Captain, you don't have authority over that woman." Sutton said, his voice cutting through cleanly, as Dr. Naomi Reeves. "She is the executive vice president and general counsel of this airline. She is the reason this company still has contracts worth flying under, and unless you want Transatlantic Airways to spend the next 5 years making your personal finances its project, I suggest you step back." The silence that followed had a particular texture, the silence of a large, crowded space in which everyone has stopped pretending to do anything other than witness. Hale's forearm went slack. He stepped back. His face did something it had probably not done in years. It lost its certainty, the authority draining out of it like water through a cracked container, leaving something raw and younger and considerably less sure of itself underneath. Claudia Marsh, 15 feet away, made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath. Naomi straightened herself off the wall. It was a slow movement, deliberate, the movement of someone who is choosing how to stand rather than simply standing, and she did it without assistance, without looking at Sutton, without looking at anyone except Officer Brett Hale. She turned to face him. Fully blazer, twisted, one strand of hair fallen from its pin, the mark on her cheek bright against her skin, and she looked at him with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier for Hale to hold, but a kind of precise, cold documentation, the expression of someone for whom this moment was already evidence. "Your full name," she said, "and your badge number." "Please." The word "please" in that sentence was not politeness. It was something else, a marker, a line in the record proof that she had remained correct in every detail, even when every detail was being used against her. Hale said his name, said his badge number. His voice was thinner than it had been 3 minutes ago. Naomi nodded once. She did not respond. She turned to Claudia Marsh, held her gaze for a measured moment, and said, "Claudia Marsh. Employee ID CM4491. Not a question. She had read the badge when she first stepped up to the podium. She had filed it. She filed everything. Claudia's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Susan moved quietly to where Naomi's documents had fallen and began gathering them, her hands careful and unhurried like someone handling something important. Naomi crouched down and picked up her laptop herself before Susan could reach it, checking the screen intact, no visible damage, and placing it back in her carry-on with the focused efficiency of someone who has a limited amount of time and intends to use all of it correctly. She accepted her documents from Susan with a brief, genuine nod of thanks and tucked them under her arm. She zipped her bag. She stood up straight. Then she turned to Caleb Osei. He was still holding his phone. He hadn't lowered it since Hale had stepped back, as though instinct was telling him that the recording was not yet complete, that whatever was still coming was going to matter. He was 24 years old, in dark jeans and a gray hoodie and a baseball cap worn straight, and he was looking at Naomi with the wide, slightly stunned expression of someone who has just watched something that will be with them for a long time. "Are you still recording?" Naomi asked him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good." She held out her card, a TAA corporate card, clean white with her name and title in small black type. "My name is Naomi Reeves. This is my direct email and my paralegal's number. Everything on that phone is evidence. Please don't post it anywhere yet. I need to control when it goes public for legal reasons. Can I count on you?" Caleb looked at the card. The way you look at something you understand is going to mean more than it currently appears to mean. "Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Thank you," Naomi said. And she meant it with a specificity that the two words could barely contain, because Caleb Osei had stood 4 people back in a boarding line and decided without anyone asking him to keep his phone steady and his angle clear, and that decision was going to matter in ways that would take months to fully understand. She turned to Captain Sutton. "Captain," she said, her voice careful and even, "I need 2 minutes before I board." "Hold the flight." "The flight will wait as long as you need," Sutton said. His voice carried something that she recognized as genuine distress, poorly disguised as composure. He was a man she could see who was trying to decide whether he had acted quickly enough and already beginning to suspect the answer. She pulled out her phone. The screen was cracked at the upper right corner from the fall, a clean fracture line running through the glass like a fault. The phone still worked. She dialed a number she had memorized 2 years ago and used perhaps a dozen times, the kind of number you keep in your head precisely because you hope never to need it. She put it on speaker. The gate area, which had been a chaotic, noisy, crowded space for the last hour, was so quiet that the dial tone carried clearly. Philip Adeyemi's assistant answered on the second ring. "This is Dr. Naomi Reeves." Naomi said, her voice projecting to the gate, and every phone currently pointed at her. "Get him. It's an emergency." A pause. A click. Then Philip's voice, the voice of a man who ran a $22 billion company, and sounded in that moment exactly like what he was, someone who cared about the person on the other end of the line. "Naomi, what's happened?" "You should be in the air. I'm still at O'Hare," she said. "Gate K-19. I was physically assaulted and illegally detained attempting to board TAA 808. She paused just long enough for the words to fully settle. The assault was carried out by Airport Police Officer Brett Hale, Badge 9203, acting on a false and defamatory report made by TAA Gate Agent Claudia Marsh, Employee ID CM4491. She told him I was fraudulent and aggressive. I was neither. The entire incident is on video." The silence on the speakerphone had weight. It was the silence of a man absorbing something that made him very, very still. 5 full seconds passed. When Philip spoke again, his voice had changed completely. It was quieter, which made it more dangerous. "Are you injured? I have a bruise on my face and pain in my shoulder," she said precisely. "I am not incapacitated. I will make the arbitration. Naomi." His voice. Just her name. Tell me what you need." "I need this flight held," she said. "I need a preservation hold on all footage and records from this gate from 3 p.m. today. I need Jessica pulled in immediately. She'll know what to do. And I need this handled, Philip, not quietly. Not with a voucher and a form letter. Handled. Those things Philip said will be done before your wheels are up. Claudia Marsh's name, employee ID again, CM4491. And the officer, Brett Hale. Badge 9203. Good. A beat. What about London?" "I will win." "London," Naomi said. "These are separate problems. I'll handle both." The pause that followed was not hesitation. It was Philip Adeyemi deciding something, and when he spoke again, his voice had the quality of something resolved, something committed to without reservation. "The people responsible for what happened to you today are going to face every consequence available to this company and every legal instrument I can put in Jessica's hands before sunrise," he said loudly enough for the gate area to hear every word. "Now please get on that plane and go save 47,000 jobs." Naomi took the phone off speaker, said quietly for Philip, "Only I know you will. Thank you. Thank." She hung up. The gate area was absolutely silent. Claudia Marsh was sitting on her stool behind the podium, her face a color that had no good name. Not white, exactly. Not gray. Something between them, the color of someone who has just understood fully and without any remaining ambiguity the exact magnitude of what they have done. She did not look at Naomi. She looked at the floor in front of her podium, and she did not look away from it. Brett Hale was being spoken to by Torres in a low, urgent voice near the gate's side wall, and Torres's body language said everything about whose side of the situation she was on. Hale stood with his arms at his sides and a stillness about him that looked less like composure and more like a man who has realized that he is standing on a fault line that has already begun to move. From somewhere in the crowd of watching passengers, a single person began to clap. Then 2 more. Then 10. It was not the loud, triumphant applause of a crowd that had watched something entertaining. It was quieter than that and more serious. The kind of applause that is also an acknowledgement that says, "We saw this, and we know what it was, and we are sorry we did not do more to stop it." Naomi did not look at the crowd. She turned and walked toward the jet bridge. Her back was straight. Her carry-on rolled silently behind her. She did not look back. Howard Larkin, TAA's O'Hare Station Director, arrived at Gate K-19 at a near sprint, his tie loosened and his phone already in his hand, the particular momentum of a man who has received a call that turned a routine Tuesday afternoon into the worst day of his professional career. He was 51 years old and had been managing airport operations for 22 of those years, and he had handled blizzards and system failures and a mechanical emergency that had stranded 300 passengers on Christmas Eve, and none of those things had prepared him for the sight of Claudia Marsh sitting behind her podium, staring at the floor while 2 TAA supervisors stood silently beside her, and a cleaning crew began, with uncomfortable symbolism, to sweep the gate area. Howard went to Claudia first. He stood in front of her. She looked up, and her eyes were red-rimmed and wet, and he could see that she was trying to assemble some version of an explanation, some ordering of events that would produce a context in which her actions made a kind of sense. But the explanation kept collapsing before it reached her mouth, because there was a detail at the center of it that could not be argued away, a single phone call she had not made. "Did you call the corporate verification line when the flag appeared?" Howard asked. The silence that answered him was its own response. He already had the system log on his phone. Jessica Morrow had sent it to TAA's legal and operations teams 17 minutes ago, and Howard had read it in the car. The flag had appeared at 4:23 p.m. At 4:24 p.m., Claudia had accessed the passenger's file. At 4:24 p.m. and 31 seconds, she had pressed the security call button. There was no record of an outgoing call to the verification desk. There was no record of any attempt to confirm the booking. There was a 31-second gap between flag and security, and in that gap, Claudia Marsh had made a decision about who Naomi Reeves was based on information the system had not provided her. "I need your badge," Howard said. Claudia unpinned it from her jacket with hands that were not fully steady. She held it out to him, and he took it without ceremony, and the moment it left her hand, the 22 years behind it left with it, because a badge is not just metal and plastic, it is authorization. And authorization, once revoked, takes everything it had been lending you along with it. "You're suspended pending investigation," Howard said. "Security will escort you out." He turned away before she could respond, because there was nothing she could say that would change what the log already showed, and he had other fires to manage. Across the terminal, in the small windowless room of the airport police substation that smelled of old coffee and fluorescent light, Brett Hale was seated across a table from his sergeant, a woman named Dana Pruitt, who had 30 years on the force, and the particular stillness of someone who has seen enough bad decisions made by people who should have known better that she no longer wasted energy on surprise. Raymond Cole, TAA's head of airport security partnerships, sat to Pruitt's right. He had driven from the TAA Operations Center in under 8 minutes, and he had arrived with 3 printed pages: the timestamp log from the gate area cameras, an initial incident report from Torres, and a still frame from Caleb Osei's footage showing the moment of impact. He placed the still frame on the table face up and did not say anything for a moment. He let Hale look at it. In the image, Naomi's hands were visible on both sides, open, not raised, not reaching for anything. Her face was turned slightly away from the wall. Her expression captured in the half-second before impact, not afraid, not aggressive, but alert, the expression of someone who had already decided how they were going to survive this moment. Hale's face was in profile, and his expression was a different thing entirely. It was the face of a man who had stopped making decisions and started making statements. She used the words "probable cause." Hale said eventually, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who has realized mid-sentence that the sentence is not going to help him. "That told me she was lawyering up. I assessed a non-compliance risk." "She was a lawyer," Cole said. A pause. Torres entered the room and sat in the chair to Hale's left. She did not look at her partner. When Pruitt addressed her, Torres's account was delivered in the measured, unhurried tone of someone who had been thinking about what she needed to say since the moment it happened, which was also the moment she had tried to prevent it. She said she had used his first name twice. She said he had not responded to either instance. She said Naomi Reeves had been standing in the boarding line with her hands visible at all times, and her voice at a consistent register, and that nothing she had observed in the 4 minutes preceding the use of force met any threshold she recognized as requiring physical intervention. She said the word personal when Pruitt asked her to characterize the decision. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Pruitt asked for Hale's badge. His jaw moved once like he was going to say something that might change the outcome, and then it stopped because there was nothing that could change it. The camera had been running. Torres had spoken, and the still frame was still lying face up on the table in front of him like a door that had already been opened and could not be closed again. He unclipped his badge and placed it on the table. In a black SUV moving north on the 90 toward O'Hare, Philip Adeyemi sat in the back seat with his phone and the focused, dangerous quiet of a man converting fury into action. His first call was to TAA's legal department head, a man named Robert Finch, who had been TAA's outside counsel before Philip recruited him in-house. "Full preservation hold effective now. Every camera angle, every personnel record, every system log associated with Gate K-19 from 3 p.m. today. Pull Claudia Marsh's complete employment file tonight. I have a strong feeling we are not looking at a first incident." His second call was to the Chicago Airport Authority director at his personal cell number. Philip did not threaten. He described. He named the officer, named the badge number, described the footage in 3 sentences. He said I would like to hear from you before my plane lands at Heathrow, that this has been addressed at the level it deserves. He ended the call before the director could finish his first sentence. His third call was to Jessica Morrow. Jessica answered on the first ring. She was already at her desk. Philip had called her 40 minutes ago, and she had not left the building since. He told her what he needed: the complete employment file on Claudia Marsh, the full system log on the payment flag, verification of the protocol documentation, and a complete evidence package ready for Naomi when she landed in London. "Already started," Jessica said. He ended the call and looked out the window at the expressway, the Chicago skyline receding behind him, the last of the afternoon light going orange over the lake. He felt the specific helpless fury of a man who has built something carefully and watched someone else carelessly damage it, and he let himself feel it fully for 30 seconds, and then he set it aside, because fury without direction was a waste of resources, and he had work to do. He pulled up the email from Jessica, already in his inbox, subject line: Initial log CM-4491. He opened the attachment. He began to read. By the time his SUV reached the terminal, he had read 6 of the 17 complaint entries and had reached a conclusion that sat in his chest like a cold, hard weight. This was not a single bad Tuesday. This had been building for a very long time, and somewhere in AA's management layers 17 times over 6 years, someone had looked at evidence of a pattern and decided that a form letter and a travel voucher was an adequate response. He was going to change that. But first, he had an arbitration to win. The cabin door sealed with the soft, pneumatic sound of a world closing itself off from another, and for a moment after it sealed, the aircraft was simply a long, quiet tube of humming air and soft lighting. And Naomi sat in 1A with her carry-on stowed and her hands in her lap and her eyes closed, and let herself do something she had not done since 1 a.m. the previous night. Nothing. Just for a moment. Just to let the gate area stop replaying behind her eyes long enough for her to take a full breath. Susan Park had escorted her to the seat without ceremony, with the particular competence of a senior purser who has seen passengers in various states of distress and knows that the most useful thing she can do is provide practical help without requiring the person to perform gratitude while they are still in the process of holding themselves together. Susan had brought water and an improvised ice pack, 2 small towels wrapped around a bag of ice from the galley, and had knelt beside the seat and offered it with both hands. And Naomi had looked at the ice pack for a moment before accepting it, pressing it to her cheekbone with a careful steadiness, because accepting help required acknowledging that she needed it, and acknowledging that she needed it required acknowledging what had just happened, and she was not quite ready to do that at full volume yet. "Thank you, Susan," she said. "I am so sorry." Susan said low private, not a corporate apology, but a human one. What happened at that gate, it shouldn't have. It shouldn't be something that happens. "It wasn't your fault," Naomi said, and she meant it. "You helped. You and the captain, you helped." She paused. "How is he?" Susan looked at her steadily. "He's angry," she said. "Not at you. He called flight operations before we pushed back. He said it was the worst thing he'd seen at a gate in 30 years. A pause. "I think he's angry at himself for not coming out sooner." Naomi nodded, but didn't respond to that. There was something to be said about the timing of interventions, about all the small moments in the sequence where a different decision by a different person might have changed the shape of what happened, but this was not the time for it. And the ice pack against her cheek was reminding her that her body had absorbed something real, something that would be visible and present for days, and she needed to be careful with her remaining energy. The plane pushed back from the gate. Captain Sutton's voice came over the intercom, stripped of its usual warm welcome aboard cadence, sounding instead like what it was, a man being professionally careful about something he felt deeply. He said there had been a serious incident at the gate. He said it had been addressed by the TAA team. He said he apologized for the delay and thanked the passengers for their patience. He did not say more than that, but the specific flatness of his voice, the controlled steadiness of it, said something on its own. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the adrenaline that had been holding Naomi upright began finally to release its grip. It didn't leave all at once, it never did, but it loosened like a fist, unclenching slowly. And in the space it left behind, the pain arrived her shoulder from the impact with the wall, the ache running up through the joint, her upper arm, where Hale's fingers had been, which would be bruised by morning, and her cheek, which stung cleanly and persistently under the ice pack. These were manageable. She had worked through worse pain at a desk. She had argued a contract dispute in Singapore with a 102-degree fever and won. It was the other thing that was harder to locate and harder to name. The thing that was not in her shoulder or her cheek, but somewhere in the cavity of her chest, the hot, pressurized feeling of having been reduced publicly in front of 50 people and their cameras in the building that carried her company's name to a category, a problem, a flag on a system that someone had not bothered to verify. She had stood at that podium and given Claudia Marsh her name and title, and it had meant nothing less than nothing had been received as a performance rather than a fact, and the specific pain of that of being accurate and being dismissed simultaneously was the kind of pain that had no single location in the body because it was everywhere at once. She thought about her mother. She thought about Sunday nights at the kitchen table. The iron moving in steady passes over the uniform, the collar perfect, the cuffs straight, the ritual of preparation for a job that would take everything you offered and still manage to pass you over for the international routes you had earned 3 times over. Gloria Reeves had never filed a complaint, had never had the language for it or the infrastructure to support it or the certainty that the language would be heard even if she had it. Naomi had all of those things. She had the title and the contacts and the CEO's personal number and a paralegal who was already building the case at 4 a.m. She had the bruise on her face and the video on Caleb O'Sea's phone and the 31-second system log and 17 documented complaints that were about to become something other than filed and forgotten. She had every tool her mother hadn't had. And she had still ended up with her face against drywall. The plane lifted off. Chicago fell away beneath the wings, the grid of lights spreading outward from the dark thread of the river, the lake black and vast to the east. The familiar city becoming unfamiliar from this height, the way all known things become unfamiliar when you get far enough away from them. Naomi watched it for a moment. The city she had lived in for 20 years. The city that contained O'Hare and Gate K-19 and Claudia Marsh's podium, and the wall she had been pressed against, and the 31 seconds that had produced all of it. She opened her laptop. She opened a new document. She did not open the Harlow file yet. She opened a blank page, and she typed at the top a subject line that she had been composing in some part of her mind since the plane pushed back from the gate the standard we owe. She looked at it, left it. She typed 2 words below the subject line. Delia Fraser. She did not know yet who Delia Fraser was. She would read Jessica's file over Newfoundland and find out. But she was already making space for the name already understanding with the instinct of someone who has spent 20 years reading patterns in documents that the 31 seconds at Gate K-19 were not the beginning of anything. They were the latest entry in something much longer. She saved the document. Closed it, opened the Harlow file. The Boeing 787 climbed into the dark Illinois sky, its navigation lights blinking steadily against the black, carrying its passengers north and east over the lake and into the long crossing. And Dr. Naomi Reeves read case law at 35,000 feet with an ice pack in her lap and a bruise forming along her cheekbone, and the clean, cold resolution of someone who has decided precisely and without ambiguity what they are going to do next. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin had dimmed to the particular blue-gray twilight of a long overnight crossing that manufactured dusk that the airlines deploy around hour 2 to convince your body it is already night, already time to surrender to sleep to make the 8 hours feel shorter than they are. Most of the first-class cabin had accepted the suggestion. The seats around Naomi were reclined, the reading lights dark, the quiet broken only by the low, ambient hum of the engines and the occasional soft movement of the flight crew through the cabin. Naomi was not asleep. She had not even attempted it. The Harlow file was spread across her tray table in the organized way she always worked. Not chaotic, not cramped, but distributed with the spatial logic of someone who thinks in documents, who needs to be able to see 4 things at once to understand how they relate to each other. The core of Harlow's argument was as she had told Philip 3 weeks ago, a bad argument dressed in an expensive suit. But bad arguments did not die simply from being wrong. They required precise killing and precision. Required that she understand not just where the argument was incorrect, but why Crane had chosen to make it what he thought his strongest ground was, and where he expected her to push back so that she could push back somewhere else entirely. She worked steadily, the ice pack long since discarded her shoulder, aching in a low and persistent way that she had categorized and set aside. The bruise on her cheek had deepened while she worked. She could feel the change in it, the way the skin tightens as a bruise matures. But she did not check it in a mirror, and she did not reach for a pain reliever because doing either would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have cost her something she could not currently afford to spend. Susan checked on her once appearing at the edge of her peripheral vision with the trained quietness of someone who understood the difference between attentiveness and interruption. She offered food. Naomi accepted without looking up something in a small dish that was either risotto or something adjacent to it, and ate it in 3 or 4 minutes without tasting any of it, her eyes moving between documents, while her hands managed the fork on muscle memory alone. The man across the aisle had been watching her work for most of the last hour, without appearing to. He was somewhere in his late 60s, silver-haired, the sort of man who has spent enough time in first class that he has stopped noticing what kind of wine they're serving a man for whom this seat, this altitude, this level of access is simply Tuesday. He had been at the gate. Naomi had registered him in her peripheral vision during the confrontation. He had been standing near the back of the crowd watching, not filming. He leaned across the narrow aisle now. "I was at the gate," he said without preamble, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I watched the whole thing. I'm sorry I didn't do anything." A pause. "I should have said something." Naomi set down her pen and looked at him. She let the words land without trying to fix them or smooth them over because they deserved to land as they were, imperfect, late, and real. "Thank you for saying so," she said. And then, because she believed in being precise, even in the moments that didn't require it, it would have helped. He nodded once, accepting that, and turned back to his window. Naomi looked at the document in front of her for a moment before picking up her pen again. The interaction had cost her nothing, and given her something small but solid, the specific modest comfort of being seen accurately by a stranger. It was not justice. It was not enough. It was also something, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She went back to work. The plane flew on eastward through the dark over the coastline and out above the Atlantic, and the cabin breathed around her in the slow rhythm of sleeping passengers. And below them the ocean was dark and vast and completely indifferent to all of it, to the gate and the wall and the badge and the 31 seconds and the arbitration waiting on the other side of the crossing, and the 47,000 jobs stacked quietly behind her closing argument. Indifferent in the way that large bodies of water are indifferent, which is to say, completely and permanently and without malice. Which was, Naomi had always thought, the only kind of indifference worth aspiring to. She turned a page. At 9:14 p.m. Chicago time, which was 3:14 a.m. in London and somewhere over Newfoundland on the TAA 808. Jessica Morrow was in the TAA legal department on the 22nd floor of the Transatlantic Airways headquarters building with 4 monitors running and a coffee that had been cold for 2 hours that she kept picking up and setting back down without drinking. Jessica was 28 years old and had worked for Naomi Reeves for 3 years. And in those 3 years, she had learned that the job at its core was about building the most airtight, most fully documented, most irreversible version of the truth that it was possible to construct, because the truth without documentation was just a story, and stories could be disputed, and Naomi Reeves did not dispute things she could prove. Philip had called her before Naomi's plane reached cruising altitude. He had used the phrase, "burn it down carefully," which Jessica understood to mean, find everything, document everything, and make sure that when the consequences land, they are impossible to contest. She started with the payment flag. The TAA automated fraud detection system kept granular logs, timestamps to the second user access records, flag generation data, verification, attempt records. She pulled the log for Gate K19 Flight 808 passenger Reeves N ticket number beginning with TAA-EX, the executive booking prefix. The flag had been generated at 16:23:07:4:23 p.m. and 7 seconds. The flag code was HVAL-ANOM-01, meaning high-value anomalous booking a flag, generated when a full-fare international one-way ticket is booked within 18 hours of departure on a registered corporate account. It was the second most common flag in the executive booking system. It was also the flag with the clearest, most straightforward resolution protocol. Call the corporate verification desk, reference the booking number, receive confirmation, proceed. Average resolution time 53 seconds. At 16:23:38:31 seconds after the flag appeared, Gate Agent CM4491 had pressed the security request button. There was no outgoing call to the verification desk. There was no access to the verification protocol page in the gate agent's terminal. There was a gap of 31 seconds between flag and security call, and in that gap the log showed only one action. CM4491 had opened the passenger's booking file and viewed the profile photo attached to the frequent flyer account. Jessica sat with that for a moment. Then she typed it into her summary document with the specific, careful language of someone who understands that the way you word a thing determines what it can be used to do. Then she opened Claudia Marsh's employment file, 22 years with TAA, an early record that was genuinely strong. 12 years of solid performance reviews, 5 commendations, 2 letters from passengers, 1 internal recognition award from the Chicago Hub's regional director. Then, beginning about 6 years ago, a slow and undeniable change in the record's character. The commendations stopped. The performance reviews became shorter, less specific, and the complaints began. 17 of them over 6 years. Jessica read each one in order of date, and as she read them, she built a spreadsheet date, passenger name, nature of complaint resolution, follow-up. The pattern that emerged was not subtle. 11 of the 17 complaints were from passengers who identified as Black or Hispanic. In 9 of those 11, Claudia had used the word aggressive or non-compliant in her incident report. In all 17 cases, the resolution column read, verbal counseling, travel voucher issued, matter closed, no retraining, no formal written warning, no escalation to HR beyond the initial intake. The same form letter, adapted slightly, sent 17 times. And then the file closed and Claudia Marsh went back to Gate K19, and 6 weeks later, a new complaint arrived, and the process repeated. The 14th complaint, filed approximately 14 months ago by a passenger named Delia Frazier, was different from the others in one specific way. The complaint form itself was standard, the language of someone writing carefully in a space that has word limits and checkboxes. But at the bottom of the form, in the additional comment section in handwriting that was small and deliberate, and slightly uneven, as though the writer had pressed harder than they meant to. Delia Fraser had written, "I just want someone to know it happened. I don't expect anything to change." Jessica looked at that sentence for a long time. Then she attached Delia Fraser's form as a separate document not buried in the exhibit file, not listed as Exhibit 14, but sent as its own attachment with its own subject line. "Please read this one specifically." She added a note. "This is why the resolution protocol matters." She sent the complete package to Philip Adeyemi and to Naomi's London email at 10:47 p.m. Chicago time. She labeled it, "Read when you land. This is not one incident." Then she pulled up Officer Brett Hale's record from the Airport Authority's Interagency Personnel Database, a database TAA had access to under a security partnership agreement that most people at TAA didn't know existed and almost nobody used. 2 prior use-of-force complaints. The first 4 years ago, a black male passenger flagged by a gate agent for suspicious behavior, restrained by Hale and one other officer later determined to have been a first-class passenger who had boarded the wrong gate and was attempting to correct the error. Complaint dismissed. Finding force within acceptable parameters. The second 2 years ago, a Latina woman in her 30s pulled aside at a security checkpoint on a tip from a TSA agent physically restrained when she objected to having her bag searched without explanation. Complaint dismissed. Finding subject was non-compliant. Standard procedure applied. Same language. Different passenger, same outcome. Jessica added this to the package with a single line of annotation. Pattern of behavior predating this incident by at least 4 years. She sent a final email to Philip. "Package is complete. Everything you need is there." He knew what he was doing. So did she. She sat back in her chair and looked at the 4 monitors and the cold coffee and the dark windows of the Chicago night. And she thought about Delia Fraser's handwriting and the specific defeat in a sentence that expects nothing to change. And she made herself a private promise that it wasn't going to say that anymore. She read Jessica's email over Newfoundland. She knew roughly where she was because she had a habit on long night flights of periodically checking the route map on the seatback screen. A habit she had never analyzed but suspected had something to do with the lawyer's instinct to always know exactly where you are before deciding what to do next. The map showed the small airplane icon positioned at the northeastern edge of the Canadian landmass, the Atlantic spreading out ahead of it in the flat blue simplicity of a rendering that had no interest in what the actual ocean looked like from above, which was dark and enormous and without reference points. She opened the email. She read the payment flag log first, and the 31 seconds sat inside her like a cold stone. Not because she was surprised by it, she had known from the moment it happened that the decision had not been procedural, but because seeing it documented time-stamped to the second, reduced to a number, made it real in a different way than experience makes things real. 31 seconds. Claudia Marsh had needed 31 seconds to make a decision about what Naomi Reeves was, and the decision had not required a phone call, had not required a conversation, had not required anything more than a flag and a face and a gap between them that a certain kind of certainty had been more than willing to fill. She read the employment file next in order. She read all 17 complaints. She read the dates and the names and the careful, formal language of people writing in the limited space of a complaint form about something that had happened to them in a boarding line or a gate area or a security checkpoint. Something that had been small enough for the system to absorb and large enough to make them sit down afterward and write it out because they needed someone to know. She read the resolution column voucher issued, matter closed over and over, the same phrase appearing with the regularity of a thing that has become automatic. A procedure so habitual it no longer required thought, a form letter so practiced it could be sent in seconds. She stopped at Delia Fraser's complaint. She read the standard form. She read the additional comments section. She read, "I just want someone to know it happened. I don't expect anything to change." She read it 3 times. The cabin was quiet around her. the breathing dark of sleeping passengers, the low engine hum, the occasional small movement of the flight crew. Outside the window was the Atlantic, invisible in the dark, present only as an absence of lights below. She was at 35,000 feet over an ocean, with a bruise on her face and a cold stone in her chest, reading the handwriting of a woman who had sat down to write a complaint about something that had happened to her, and had already, in the act of writing it, given up on being heard. Naomi had a title. She had a CEO's personal number. She had a paralegal who built evidence packages at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday. She had today been slammed into a wall and had walked out of the gate area with the CEO's voice on a speakerphone and 50 witnesses filming, and a young man named Caleb Osei, who would sign an affidavit without hesitation, and the consequences were already in motion, already unstoppable, already grinding toward accountability with the precision of a legal team that had been given everything it needed. Delia Fraser had had none of that. She had had a complaint form with a word count limit and a handwriting she pressed into harder than she meant to, and she had written, "I don't expect anything to change," because she had learned from experience that the machine that receives complaints about itself rarely uses those complaints to change itself. The machine issues a voucher. The machine sends a form letter. The machine marks the matter closed. And the person who filed the complaint goes back to their life carrying the weight of what happened, plus the additional weight of having been heard and ignored, which is in some ways heavier. Naomi opened her standard we owe document. She added below the subject line, below the blank space where Delia Fraser's name already was. This woman filed a complaint 14 months ago. We sent her a voucher. Her name is where this begins. She did not write anything else in the document that night. She saved it. She sat with the weight of it. She let herself feel fully and without management the specific sorrow of understanding that she had been at this company for 12 years and had not known about Delia Fraser, had not known about any of them, had not asked the question that would have produced the answer because no one had brought the question to her door, and she had been busy, and the system had been absorbing the complaints quietly and marking the matters closed. She was the general counsel. The responsibility of what the system had been doing with those complaints did not stop at Claudia Marsh or Howard Larkin. It came in some measure to rest at her own desk. She sat with that too. Then she closed the standard we owe document. She opened the Harlow file. She had been over the force majeure argument 100 times, and she would go over it 101, because the preparation was what made the delivery look effortless. And the delivery had to look effortless, because tomorrow at 10 a.m. in a wood-paneled room in London, she was going to walk in with a bruise on her face and save 47,000 jobs, and then she was going to come home and do something about Delia Fraser. Both things. In that order. She picked up her pen. The plane began its descent at 5:43 a.m. London time, and the sky outside the window was that particular shade of pewter that exists only in the pre-dawn over the English coast, not dark anymore, but not light yet, the color of a world that has not quite decided to begin the horizon line, barely distinguishable from the sky above it. The Thames estuary was below somewhere invisible in the gray, and beyond it, the city was waking up into a morning that did not know and did not care about the previous night. Susan touched her arm gently to bring her back from wherever she had been for the last hour, which had been somewhere between sleep and its vicinity. Not fully one, not fully the other. A suspended state that left her body rested enough to function, and her mind still running, working through arguments in the half-lit space between consciousness and its absence. "We're about 40 minutes out, Dr. Reeves," Susan said softly. "David Kwan is at the jet bridge." Naomi nodded. Stretched carefully. Her shoulder was stiff. The impact had settled into it overnight and would stay there for days, and her cheek, when she pressed 2 fingers gently to the bone, was tender in a way that told her the bruise had done what bruises do. Spread, darkened, made itself known. She gathered her documents, repacked her bag, stood and moved to the small lavatory at the front of the cabin, closing the door behind her in the narrow blue-white space that smelled of recycled air and the specific functional cleanliness of airline bathrooms. She ran cold water, washed her face carefully avoiding the cheekbone, patted dry. She looked in the mirror. She was 44 years old and she had not slept properly in 2 days, and it showed the particular fatigue that settles around the eyes and in the set of the jaw, the thinness of a face that has been running on adrenaline and case law and cold risotto at altitude. And the bruise. It was clean and specific and clearly the result of contact with a hard surface running in a shallow arc from below her eye to the line of her cheekbone, the center of it dark and the edges feathered into yellow-green. It was visible from across a room. It would be visible in every room she walked into today. She gave herself 30 seconds. Not to cry. She was not going to cry, not here, not yet, not in a lavatory over the Thames while she had work to do, but to feel it, to stand in the narrow mirror and let herself be the thing she was, which was a woman who had been doing everything right for 20 years and had still ended up with her face against a wall, and to feel the specific, righteous, particular anger of that, the anger of having been twice as prepared, twice as documented, twice as precise, carrying twice the credential and still being reduced in 31 seconds to a flag on a screen and a judgment made without evidence. She let herself feel it, all of it, all. Then she breathed. One breath, steady and deliberate all the way in and all the way out, the breath of someone who is choosing what comes next. She opened her carry-on. Inside, folded carefully between 2 pieces of tissue paper, the way she folded it before every major case was her battle armor, a dark charcoal suit precisely tailored that she had bought specifically for arbitrations of this magnitude because she had learned early that what you wear in a high-stakes room is not vanity. It is a signal, a statement, a way of telling the room what kind of person has entered it before you've said a word. A cream blouse, low heels, her earrings. She dressed in the narrow lavatory with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been doing this for a very long time in whatever space was available. She looked in the mirror again. The suit was exactly what it was supposed to be. The earrings were exactly what they were, the ones she had bought herself on Michigan Avenue 20 years ago in a store where the saleswoman had assumed she was shopping for someone else. Her hair was pulled back with the severe, deliberate tightness she used when she wanted her face to be the thing the room looked at, not her hair. And the bruise was still there, visible along the cheekbone, clear and undeniable. She considered it for a moment. She had a small cosmetics bag in her carry-on. She did not open it. The bruise was going to stay. Not as a performance of victimhood she was not interested in performing. Anything was specifically uninterested in the way that visible wounds could be used to substitute for argument to generate sympathy in place of compelling the room on the merits. But because covering it would be a kind of lie, and she had never been interested in lies, even convenient ones, even the kind you tell with a makeup brush in an airplane lavatory. What had happened had happened. It was on a video on Caleb Osei's phone. It was in a system log time-stamped to the second. It was on her face. These things were consistent. She intended to keep them that way. She put the cosmetics bag away. She took one more breath. Then she opened the lavatory door and walked back into the cabin, and Susan, standing near the galley, looked at her, at the suit, at the bruise, at the expression, and something in Susan's eyes that had been tight with worry since the previous evening released slightly. Not because the worry was gone, but because she recognized what she was looking at, which was a woman who had decided what she was going to do and had the capacity to do it. Neither of them said anything. The plane touched down at Heathrow at 6:41 a.m. David Kwan was waiting at the jet bridge with the particular poised efficiency of a man who has been briefed thoroughly and is determined to be exactly as useful as the situation requires, and no more intrusive than that. He was 40 precise in his dress, with the calm of someone who had spent 15 years managing crises in international airports, and had learned that the most valuable thing you could offer a person who had just crossed the Atlantic in difficult circumstances was forward movement, the next step clearly identified already in progress. "Dr. Reeves," he said when she emerged. "I'm David Kwan. Mr. Adeyemi sent me." A half-second assessment of her face, the suit, the bruise, the expression, and then with professional grace, "The car is 3 minutes away. A medical team is available." "If—" "No medical team," Naomi said. "The hotel and then the arbitration complex." "What time is it?" 6:42. "The panel convenes at 10. That's enough time." Philip Adeyemi was in the terminal, not the arrivals hall, which told her that he had moved faster than she would have predicted and cared more than he was going to admit in public. He was standing near the gate exit in a dark suit with his hands in his pockets, and the posture of a man who has been pacing for an hour and stopped only recently, and when he saw her, he walked toward her with the directness of someone who has stopped managing his expression and is simply responding to what he sees. He stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at the bruise. He didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm ready," she said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." She let a beat pass. "Both are true." Philip nodded slowly. "Claudia Marsh was terminated this morning, effective from the moment of the incident. Hale is on administrative leave. The internal affairs investigation opened last night. The airport authority director called me at midnight. The mayor's office issued a written statement this morning." He paused. "Jessica's package is the most complete thing I've ever seen her produce, and she produces extraordinary things." "I know she does," Naomi said. "It's not enough yet. The lawsuit still needs to be filed, and the 17 complaints need to become something other than a closed file." "They will," Philip said. "I know they will," she said. "I'm going to make sure of it. But first, London." He walked with her toward the exit, David Kwan moving ahead to coordinate the car. For a few seconds it was just the two of them in the corridor, and Philip said without looking at her, his voice lower and more private than anything else he had said, "I should have looked at her file. Someone should have looked at it years ago and nobody did. That's on me." Naomi received that. She did not rush to absolve him, and she did not let it land harder than it deserved to. "Yes," she said simply. "We'll fix it." The Mercedes was at the curb. David briefed her during the 20-minute drive to the legal complex near Gray's Inn. The arbitration panel's composition, their backgrounds, Peter Crane's known tendencies in closing arguments, the placement of documents in the room. She listened with the focused absorption of someone who is already thinking 4 layers deep into a problem and is receiving new information into a structure that is fully prepared to receive it. The Thames appeared briefly through a gap between buildings as they crossed it, iron gray in the early morning, flat and wide and calm, the city reflected in it, in long, broken lines. She looked at it without reaction. London looked like what it always looked like, permanent, indifferent, occupied with itself. She arrived at the complex at 8:12 a.m., with just under 2 hours before the panel convened. She went to the small preparation room TAA had reserved, laid out her documents in the precise arrangement she used for every arbitration, ate the breakfast David had arranged without tasting it, and went through her closing argument one final time, not because she needed to, but because the ritual of preparation was itself a form of readiness, a way of telling herself that everything that needed to be done had been done, that she was standing at the edge of the thing, fully equipped. At 9:55 a.m. she stood up, buttoned her jacket, touched the earrings once with 2 fingers, and walked to the arbitration room. The room was exactly what it had been designed to be, serious, permanent, and faintly intimidating, its walls paneled in dark wood that absorbed the morning light from the narrow windows and returned it softer, darker, the light of a space that takes its own history seriously. 3 arbitrators sat at the elevated panel table. A retired judge named Hargreaves at center, flanked by 2 senior commercial law practitioners whose names Naomi had read in David's briefing and whose published opinions she had read 2 weeks before that. The Harlow Capital team was already seated on the far side of the counsel table when she entered 6 people-expensive suits, the particular easy confidence of a team that had spent a great deal of money convincing itself it was going to win. Peter Crane sat at the head of their side, a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and the fluid, unhurried manner of a lawyer who had won enough cases to have developed an aesthetic of inevitability, a way of inhabiting a room that suggested the outcome was already settled and the proceedings were largely ceremonial. He stood when Naomi entered, extended his hand, and said with a pleasantness that had a probe embedded in it, "Dr. Thornton Reeves, forgive me. We were concerned you might not make it. We heard there was some trouble with your flight." The room went still in the particular way rooms go still when everyone is pretending not to listen. Naomi looked at him. She took his hand, shook it once, and said, "The trouble was resolved. The trouble, as you'll find today, is entirely on your side of the table. Shall we begin?" She sat. The panel called the session to order. Crane's opening was polished and built with the precision of a lawyer who understood that arbitration panels were not juries, that you could not win them with emotion or theater alone, that you needed to construct a framework and then inhabit it with such confidence that the panel began to see the world through it before the other side could offer an alternative. His framework was TAA is a company in institutional disorder. The 2022 fuel crisis was foreseeable to any competent management team. TAA's failure to disclose its exposure was a material breach. Harlow Capital, as a subsequent investor, was harmed. The merger covenant was void. He said it all with the measured certainty of a man who had rehearsed it many times and found it convincing every time. Naomi's rebuttal did not match his register. Where Crane had been expansive, she was specific. Where he had offered a framework, she offered a document, a specific page, a specific clause, a specific word, each one chosen with the patience of someone who had written the original contracts herself and knew exactly where the load-bearing structures were. She did not argue against Crane's framework. She dissolved it from underneath by demonstrating document by document that the factual premises it rested on were wrong. The force majeure clause was the center of everything. Crane had argued that the 2022 fuel crisis was a foreseeable event, that TAA's management had sufficient warning to prepare, that their failure to disclose this preparation or lack thereof was the breach. It was a reasonable argument on its surface. It required only that the panel accept the premise that the crisis was foreseeable. Naomi did not argue that it was unforeseeable. She let Harlow Capital's own documents argue it for her. In discovery, TAA's legal team had obtained Harlow's internal investment analysis from the period immediately preceding the merger, the document their own analysts had produced to assess TAA as an acquisition target. On page 34 of that analysis, in a section titled Macroeconomic Risk Assessment, a Harlow Capital analyst had written in unambiguous language that the global fuel markets presented highly unpredictable volatility and that no reasonable operational planning model could be expected to fully anticipate market movements of the magnitude that materialized in 2022. Harlow Capital's own analyst had called it unpredictable. In writing, with a date stamp, Naomi placed the document in front of each arbitrator with the quiet efficiency of someone distributing evidence that she knows will not require explanation, and then she gave the explanation anyway. 3 sentences precise and without flourish, and watched Peter Crane's face do the thing that faces do when the ground has shifted and the shift has been documented. The cross-examination of Harlow's key witness, a senior vice president named Jeffrey Stiles, a man in his 50s who had the specific confidence of someone who had given depositions before and found them manageable, was the chapter's centerpiece, and it lasted 47 minutes, and Naomi conducted it with the patience of someone who knows exactly where the path ends and is in no hurry to get there, because arriving correctly matters more than arriving quickly. She did not attack Styles. She asked questions. Each question was constructed to produce one of two possible answers, both of which for Styles led to the same place. He began to contradict his own deposition in the third question. By the 15th, he was actively working to reconcile statements that could not be reconciled. Naomi let him work. She waited. When she finally showed the panel the specific point in his deposition where his testimony today directly contradicted his sworn statement of 14 months ago, not adjacent to it, not in tension with it, but flatly word for word contradictory, she did not underline it. She simply read both statements aloud, one after the other in the same tone of voice, and let the silence after them do what silence does when it is positioned correctly. By the time Naomi returned to her seat, 2 of Crane's 6 team members had stopped taking notes. The third was looking at the table rather than at the panel. Crane himself was writing something not notes, Naomi suspected, but thinking on paper, the kind of writing you do when the ground has shifted and you are trying to locate something solid to stand on. After the lunch recess, the room had the particular quality of a space where something has already been decided, but the form of it still needs to be observed the way a storm has already broken overhead, but the last of the rain is still falling necessary and real, even though the worst of it has passed. Crane delivered his closing with the professional composure of a man who has been in losing positions before and knows how to inhabit them with dignity. He made the strongest version of the case available to him, which was a considerably weaker version than the one he had walked in with that morning. He sat down. Naomi stood. She did not move to the center of the room immediately. She stood at the counsel table for a moment, a deliberate beat establishing quiet before she used it, and then she walked forward with the unhurried authority of someone who knows where she is going and has no doubt that the room will follow. She began with the contract, not as an abstraction, not as a premise, as a text word by word, the specific language of the merger covenant read aloud in the clear, measured voice of the person who had written it. She had always believed that if you wanted people to understand why a document meant what it meant, you had to make them hear it, not summarize it, hear it feel the weight of each word selected, rather than the dozen words that could have replaced it. The clause in question was 47 words. She read it in full. Then she read the clause in Harlow's filing where they had interpreted it. Then she let the panel see very plainly that Harlow's interpretation had replaced 3 of the 47 words with meanings they did not carry and had built their entire case on the substitution. That established, she paused. What came next was not in her notes. She had known it was coming, had been carrying it since somewhere over Newfoundland, but she had not written it down because the things that are most true are often the ones that don't survive the process of being scripted. I would like to tell the panel something, she said, that is relevant to Mr. Crane's central argument about the character of Transatlantic Airways as a company. The room's attention shifted slightly, leaning in, not away. Yesterday afternoon, she said, her voice, even her pace unhurried. I was attempting to board. TA A808 at O'Hare International Airport, when a gate agent, an employee of Transatlantic Airways, flagged my ticket as irregular and called airport security rather than follow the 60-second verification protocol that would have resolved the matter immediately. The officer who responded used physical force to remove me from the boarding line. I was pushed against a wall. She paused for exactly 1 beat. I have a bruise on my face. You can see it. No one looked away from her. She could feel Crane processing the move, trying to locate where it was going, trying to read the trap, trying to understand how a story that sounded like an admission of institutional failure was going to become something else, and she gave him no time to settle on an interpretation before she kept moving. Mr. Crane has stood here and told you that Transatlantic Airways is a company in disorder, a company that cannot manage its own operations, a company that is at its foundations unreliable. She looked at the panel. Let me tell you what happened after I was pushed against that wall. She held up one finger. Within 1 hour, the gate agent had been suspended and a full investigation opened. A second finger. Within 2 hours, the officer had been placed on administrative leave. His use of force was under independent review, and the airport authority had been formally notified. A third finger. Within 3 hours, our CEO had personally initiated a preservation hold on every piece of evidence from that terminal, and had commissioned an independent review of the underlying personnel failures that allowed the incident to occur in the first place. She lowered her hand. The failure happened, she said. I am not standing here to tell you that what occurred at Gate K-19 was acceptable because it was not. I am standing here to tell you what kind of company responds to its own failure, because that is the question that is actually before this panel. She walked a slow half-step closer to the panel table, not aggressive, just present the way a good argument is present. Transatlantic Airways does not bury its problems. It does not issue a form letter and consider the matter resolved. When we find something broken, we find it quickly, we document it completely, and we fix it in a way that is designed to prevent the next occurrence, not just to manage the current one. She let that land. That is not a company in disorder. That is a company with the institutional honesty to look at itself clearly, and the operational capacity to act on what it sees. She turned her gaze to Peter Crane. Mr. Crane's case, like the decision made at Gate K-19 yesterday, rests on a conclusion reached before the evidence was examined. It rests on the assumption that what looks like a weakness is one that what appears to be a problem confirms the story he needs it to confirm. I am asking this panel to do what Transatlantic Airways does, look at the actual evidence, read the actual documents, apply the actual language of the actual contract. She returned to the counsel table. Henderson's case. Forgive me, Harlow's case has no merit. Not because the question it asks is illegitimate, but because the answer it offers is wrong. The clause means what it says. The fuel crisis was not foreseeable, as Harlow Capital's own analysts acknowledged in writing before the merger. The covenant was not breached. The claim should be dismissed. She sat down. The silence in the room was absolute and complete, the silence of a space that has received something and has not yet decided what to do with it. Though the decision anyone in the room with eyes could see was already substantially made. Peter Crane looked at his notes, then at the wood grain of the table in front of him. He did not look at Naomi. One of the junior members of his team was very still. The lead arbitrator, Hargreaves, made a small notation on the page in front of him. Then he looked up and said with the measured gravity of a man who has run a great many proceedings and knows when one is over, "We will take a 2-hour recess to deliberate." The small preparation room adjacent to the main arbitration chamber had a narrow window that looked onto a courtyard where pigeons were doing what London pigeons did at mid-afternoon, occupying available surfaces with the authority of creatures who understand that this city, for all its stated priorities, has always made room for them. Naomi sat in one of the straight-backed chairs with her jacket unbuttoned and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that David Kwan had pressed into them without comment, and she let herself be still for the first time since the plane touched down. The 2 TAA attorneys who had been beside her through the 6-hour session, Priya Okafor, 32, who had joined the London office 3 years ago from a commercial litigation firm, and a senior associate named Marcus Fell, were doing their level best not to appear as shaken as they were. Priya was looking at her laptop without apparently reading anything on it. Fell had his phone in his hand and was turning it over slowly like a worrystone. "You're allowed to say it," Naomi told them. Priya looked up. "Say what?" "Whatever it is you've been not saying for the last 20 minutes. Priya put down her laptop lid. She said in the direct, slightly awed tone of someone abandoning professional affect in favor of honesty, "I didn't breathe for 6 hours. I watched you do something I have never seen anyone do in a proceeding, which is, take the thing that happened to you yesterday, and use it as the closing argument that wins a case you needed to win for reasons that have nothing to do with what happened to you yesterday. A beat. And it wasn't manipulation. It wasn't sentiment. It was just true. It was just the truest thing in the room. Naomi looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it as testimony, which was how Priya had offered it. Philip called at 2:17 p.m. "How are you?" he asked. "The panel is deliberating," she said. "That's not what I asked." "Tired," she said. "More than I expected to be, which means I used something I didn't know I had." A pause. "The closing. Did you watch it?" Priya's assistant Liv texted it to me from the corridor. Word for word, apparently. A beat. You used Delia Fraser's name. "I didn't use her name," Naomi said. "I used what she taught us." "There's a difference." Philip was quiet for a moment. Then Caleb Osei signed his affidavit this morning. Jessica filed the preservation notices with the city at 9 a.m. The airport authority director sent a formal written apology to TAA before noon. He paused. "I've also been looking at the complaint files more carefully." Howard Larkin was the person who signed off on the resolutions. He signed off on 12 of 17. He didn't escalate any of them. This was not a surprise. But it had weight. "Is he still in his role?" she asked. "He submitted his resignation this morning," Philip said quietly. "I think he read the file." Naomi sat with that. "Good," she said, and the word carried no pleasure, only acknowledgement. "What else do you need?" Philip asked. "When I'm back," she said, "I'm bringing the document, the standard we owe. I need you to read it before we meet, and I need your commitment before we sit down together that we're doing all of it. Not the version that's good for press, but the version that actually changes what happens to the next person in line at K-19. You have it," Philip said. Not, of course, just the two words flat and certain. All of it. She ended the call. Sat for a moment longer in the chair with the tea and the pigeons outside and the particular stillness of a room in which something important is about to resolve. When the panel returned at 4:08 p.m., they had the compact forward-leaning posture of a group that has reached a conclusion it is ready to deliver. Hargreaves shuffled his page, once looked up and delivered the finding in the measured, unhurried language of a court that does not need to raise its voice to make itself felt. All claims dismissed. Harlow Capital versus Transatlantic Airways. All grounds. The merger covenant was found to be intact and valid. TAA was free. Across the table, the Harlow team gathered their papers with the quiet, steady efficiency of people performing composure, not looking at each other, not looking at Naomi, doing what you do when you have spent a great deal of time and money on something and are now required to leave the room without showing what losing it costs. Peter Crane stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Naomi for a moment, not with hostility and not with warmth, but with the specific, honest respect of one professional for another who has clearly done something better than you. He gave a small nod. Then he walked out. The room emptied around her. It happened gradually, the Harlow team filing out the arbitrators, rising and collecting their materials, David Kwan appearing at the door to handle the administrative closeout, Priya and Fell moving to gather the TAA documents with the energized quiet of people who have just won something and are managing the feeling carefully the way you manage something fragile. Naomi sat for a moment after everyone else had stood. Just that. One moment. The room around her going still, the voices receding toward the door, the afternoon light coming through the narrow windows in long, flat bars that fell across the council table and the empty chairs and the wood-grain floor of a room that had held something significant today and would return to holding other things tomorrow, because that was what rooms did. They held things and released them and held the next thing and kept no record. 47,000 people would keep their jobs. The contracts she had written 4 years ago at a mahogany desk in Chicago would hold because she had written them well and understood them completely, and had walked into this room with a bruise on her face and 6 hours of sleep across 3 days, and had been fully and absolutely herself for 6 straight hours without flinching. She had won this in the language of the clause, and she had won it in the boardroom 4 years ago when she chose the words, and she had won it yesterday at Gate K-19, when she did not lose herself, when she stayed precise and documented and unbroken, even with her face against a wall. Because she had understood even then that everything that was happening was going to matter, and she had to remain the kind of person it could matter through. Philip was in the corridor. He looked at her when she emerged the way people look at someone returning from a place they were not allowed to follow, with relief and recognition and the specific gratitude of a person who was waiting without knowing how to help. "Come on," he said. "You need to eat something that wasn't served at 35,000 feet in a small container." They found a small restaurant near the Thames, not a place for celebrations, not a place for press, just a corner table in a room with low light and the sound of the river outside, and ordered without ceremony. And Philip read the standard "we owe" document while Naomi ate, and she ate slowly, this time tasting what she was eating, which was a thing she had not done since Monday. He read it without speaking. When he finished, he set his phone face down on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Delia Fraser," he said. "Delia Fraser," she said. "We're doing all of it," he said. "Not a program, not an initiative, a requirement. What you've written here, the verification protocol, the complaint review threshold, the independent oversight, the personnel certification, all of it company-wide within 90 days. 60, Naomi said. He looked at her. 60, he agreed. She looked out the window. The Thames was going dark with the early London evening, the light on the water changing from gray to a deep burnished bronze as the sun dropped behind the buildings. The river moving steadily east with the specific tireless indifference of water that has been flowing past this city for longer than the city has had a name. She watched it for a moment. She thought about her mother, about Sunday nights and a uniform ironed to perfection for a job that would take everything offered and still find reasons to give the international routes to someone else. She thought about the language she had spent 20 years building, precise, documented, legally enforceable, the kind of language that turns "I was treated unfairly" into something a room full of suits has to take seriously. She had it. She had used it. She had won with it today, and she was going to use it again differently to make sure that the 17 people whose complaints became vouchers had the benefit of the infrastructure that Naomi had, and they did not. Not because they had Naomi's title, because they were people in a boarding line. "There's one more thing," she said. Philip waited. "Delia Fraser gets a call from me personally, not from the legal department, not from customer relations, from me. I'm going to tell her what her complaint produced." She paused. "She wrote that she didn't expect anything to change. I want her to know that it did." Philip looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said simply. Outside the window, London moved through its evening unhurried enormous dents with its own history. And the river moved through it, and the two of them sat at a corner table eating food that tasted like something, and it was enough for now, and the work was not over. But the worst part of it was, and that was also enough for now. She had thought the hardest part would be the termination meeting. She had sat in HR offices across from employees before in a different role years ago as a shift supervisor, before she made gate agent and decided the front line was where she belonged. And she had known even then that those meetings had a particular weight to them, a gravity produced by the gap between what a person had built over years and what a single decision had cost them, and she had always been grateful not to be on the receiving side of one. Now she was on the receiving side. The HR manager was a woman named Keisha, late 30s, calm and straight-backed, in a way that was neither unkind nor particularly warm the specific professionalism of someone who does difficult things correctly because doing them incorrectly would be worse. She read the termination terms from a document on her screen, her voice level and clear, and Claudia Marsh sat across the table and listened to 22 years of her professional life being converted into a series of findings and a closing date. Termination for cause. Documented failure to follow the TAA payment irregularity verification protocol. Documented pattern of discriminatory treatment of passengers as evidenced by 17 filed complaints over 6 years. Public accusation made against a TAA employee without factual basis constituting defamation. Effective date the previous morning. Ineligible for standard severance. COBRA available at market rate. Claudia started to speak twice, and twice she stopped because both times the sentence she had assembled over the previous 20 hours in the specific repetitive way you assemble sentences that are meant to make an impossible situation make sense. Collapsed when she tried to deliver it because the detail at its center would not hold. A 60-second phone call she had not made, a protocol she had not followed, a flag on a screen and a face below it, and 31 seconds in which she had made a decision she could not now unmake regardless of how many versions of the explanation she tried. Keisha waited until the silence made clear that Claudia was done. "Is there anything else you'd like to say for the record?" she asked. Claudia shook her head. Keisha closed the document. The meeting ended. A security officer appeared at the door with the polite, impersonal purpose of someone executing a procedure, and Claudia collected her bag and walked with him through the terminal she had worked in for 22 years. The gates, the concourse, the coffee cart she passed every morning, the long windows looking onto the tarmac where the TAA planes were lined up in the early afternoon light like a row of things that would continue without her, and she went to the parking structure and got into her car. She sat in the car for a long time without starting it. On the radio, when she finally turned the key, there was news the Harlow Capital Arbitration TAA wins a statement from CEO Philip Adeyemi. A mention of the Gate K-19 incident. The phrase "a former TAA gate agent" appeared without her name. She turned the radio off. She drove home on the expressway she had driven for 22 years. The same route, the same exits, the same overpass with the water tower visible on the left side where someone had tried to paint something and been caught before finishing it. And she thought about the 17 complaint forms she had never read, back the 17 times she had watched a supervisor write matter closed in the resolution column and had felt what vindicated protected. She was no longer sure she remembered what she had felt. She remembered the line moving. She remembered the schedule holding. She remembered the gate cleared and the flight boarding and the day proceeding as days were supposed to proceed, and she had never asked what it cost the person on the other end of the form letter, because the gate was cleared and the day was proceeding and the schedule was what it needed to be. The Delia Fraser complaint was in the record. She knew her name now from the news coverage that had referenced the internal file. She had not known it then. Had not tried to know it. Had left the resolution to someone else and turned back to the gate. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for another long time. The house was exactly as she had left it that morning, which felt like many years ago, and also like no time at all. The certainty she had carried for 22 years, the certainty that had made it possible to look at a flag on a screen and make a decision in 31 seconds was entirely, irreversibly gone, and in its place was something she did not yet have a name for, but recognized dimly as the beginning of understanding what the certainty had cost. It was a very small beginning. It was real. She went inside. The internal affairs room in the Airport Authority building had the institutional quality of a space designed to be uncomfortable, not hostile exactly, but stripped of any detail that might suggest the proceedings conducted within it were anything other than what they were. Fluorescent light, gray carpet, a table that had been wiped down too many times and still carried the faint, accumulated evidence of many difficult conversations. Sergeant Dana Pruitt sat across the table from Brett Hale with the unhurried patience of a senior officer who has run enough of these proceedings to know that the documentation, not the room, is where the outcome lives, and the documentation in this case was extensive and clear. She had read the file the previous evening. She had watched all 3 camera angles. She had read Torres's statement, which had been given voluntarily in full without hesitation, and which had the specific, unambiguous quality of an account delivered by someone who has been thinking about what they saw since the moment they saw it. Raymond Cole from TA Security sat to her right. He had brought nothing extra, no additional documents, no presentation. He had the stillness of someone who knows the footage is sufficient. The footage was played. 3 angles, the gate area wide, shot the boarding lane camera and Caleb Osei's video, which had been officially submitted as evidence and was now time-stamped and logged in the airport authorities' case file. All 3 played simultaneously on the room's monitor in a split screen that made it impossible to watch any single angle without being aware of all 3 perspectives converging on the same event. Hale watched himself. His face in profile was something Pruitt had seen many times across this table, the specific, effortful stillness of a person watching documentation of their own actions and trying in real time to construct the internal narrative that will allow them to remain who they believe themselves to be. His jaw moved once. Then it went still. Torres gave her account. She did not look at Hale. She used the word personal when describing the nature of his decision. When Pruitt asked her to elaborate, she said only, she gave him every reasonable opportunity to de-escalate. He wasn't interested in de-escalation. She paused. I've been his partner for 2 years. What I saw yesterday wasn't procedure. The union representative who had been sitting at the corner of the table with the particular discomfort of someone representing a position they know is not tenable made 2 notes on his pad and made no verbal interventions. Hale's termination was delivered at the end of the formal findings. Gross misconduct, excessive and unnecessary use of force, failure to follow established de-escalation protocol, loss of position, loss of pension 2 years from vesting a detail that landed with the specific weight of something that cannot be undone. He could appeal. He was told this. He was told what the appeal process entailed. He was told that the camera footage would be part of the appeal record. He did not ask about the appeal. The civil suit Reeves versus Hale was filed in Cook County Circuit Court 14 days after the incident. It was filed against Hale personally. Battery, unlawful detention, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Naomi's legal team had built it with the same thoroughness that characterized everything Jessica Morrow produced, documentation so complete and so thoroughly cross-referenced that Hale's attorney, a union-adjacent defense lawyer named Gary Brunt, spent most of their first meeting staring at the exhibit list. Brunt recommended settlement early. The footage was not ambiguous. Torres's testimony was not ambiguous. The complaint history from Hale's personnel file added a context that made the word pattern unavoidable. A trial would produce a public record that would follow Brett Hale everywhere he went for the rest of his professional life. Naomi's settlement terms were not financial. She was not interested in money from a man who was not going to have much of it once the legal costs were settled. She wanted 2 things. First, surrender of his peace officer standards and training certification, the credential that would allow him to work in any law enforcement capacity in any state in any jurisdiction. Mall security, school resource officer, airport police, private enforcement, any of it, all of it, gone. Second, a written public apology read aloud in a court-recorded hearing specifically acknowledging that he had acted on personal bias and had used unlawful force against a person who had done nothing wrong. The apology hearing was scheduled on a Thursday morning in late January. The courtroom was not large, and it was not full. A reporter from the Tribune, a photographer, 2 airport authority observers, and Naomi, who arrived alone and sat in the front row with her hands folded in her lap. Hale stood at the front of the room. He held the statement, a single page printed in 14-point type. and he read it in the flat, careful voice of someone doing the minimum the situation requires. He did not look up from the paper. His jaw was set throughout, and his face had the closed quality of a man who is performing accountability without experiencing it, which was Naomi understood probably as much as this moment was ever going to produce in him, and it was enough not because it was everything, but because it was the thing she had asked for, documented on the record permanent. When he finished, she stood and left without comment. Outside the courthouse, the January air was cold and flat and clean, and she stood on the steps for a moment, not celebrating, not releasing anything in particular, just being present in the morning and letting the hearing be what it was done. She had her paralegal's number dialed before she reached the bottom step. There was other work to do. 6 weeks after London. The 60-day clock Naomi had set with Philip was ticking, and she had spent most of it building. The meeting convened at 9 a.m. In TAA's main conference room at the Chicago headquarters, the large room, the one used for board presentations and company-wide briefings with the long windows looking south toward the lake and the city's winter light coming in flat and silver over the table, where 43 of TAA's senior operational and HR leaders were seated. Regional directors from 8 hubs, station managers from the 12 busiest airports in the network, department heads from HR operations training and security, the chief operations officer, the heads of legal and compliance. Philip stood at the front of the room, and he said plainly and without preamble, "We had a failure at Gate K-19 in November. That was 6 years in the making. The immediate causes have been addressed. What we're here to discuss is what we're changing in the structure that allowed it to develop." He did not call it a program. He did not call it an initiative. He did not use language that turned a problem of accountability into a marketing opportunity. He said, "These are the requirements." Then he sat down and gestured to Naomi. She stood and looked at the room. She had spent 12 years in this company, and she knew most of the faces at the table knew their names, knew their hubs, knew which station managers were meticulous, and which were operationally competent, but HR averse. She looked at them for a moment before she began, not for effect, but because she wanted to say what she was about to say to them as specific people, rather than as an audience, because what she was about to say was specific. She read Delia Fraser's name, not as a legal exhibit, not as a data point, as a person. She explained who Delia Fraser was, a passenger who had filed a complaint at Gate K 1914 months before the November incident, who had written a single additional sentence at the bottom of the form that Jessica Morrow had flagged and Naomi had read at 3 a.m. over Newfoundland, and which had been sitting in her chest like a cold stone ever since "I just want someone to know it happened." I don't expect anything to change. The room was quiet. There were 16 other people, Naomi said, who filed complaints about treatment at this gate over 6 years. All 16 received form letters and travel vouchers. 11 of them were passengers of color. In 9 of those cases, our own gate agent described them as aggressive. In her incident report, the same word she used to describe me when she called security. Those complaints were received, processed, and closed. Nobody read the file. Nobody looked at the pattern. She paused. "This is what we're fixing." She laid out the changes, not as a list, but as a narrative. Each change connected to the failure it was designed to prevent, each requirement grounded in a specific thing that had gone wrong. Every passenger complaint involving race, ethnicity, or perceived profiling would now be reviewed by a designated human supervisor within 24 hours. Not logged, not filed. Reviewed, eyes on it, a human being making a determination about whether it required follow-up. 3 similar complaints against a single employee within any 18-month period would trigger an automatic independent review. That review would not be conducted by the employee's direct supervisor. Every gate agent, every boarding crew member, every customer-facing TAA employee would complete annual certification in the company's passenger verification protocols. Not a slideshow watched at home, but a proctored, documented in-person certification. Failure to certify meant reassignment from customer-facing roles. Repeated failure meant termination. The automated fraud detection system, the system that had generated the flag on Naomi's ticket, would be modified to include a mandatory logged verification attempt before any security call could be made in connection with a payment flag. The log would be permanent. If an employee called security on a flagged ticket without a logged verification attempt, it would generate an automatic HR flag on their record. A passenger advocacy line staffed by trained human beings rather than automated menus would be operational at every major TAA hub within 60 days. The line would be answered. The records would be kept. The outcomes would be reported quarterly to the executive team. Howard Larkin's successor as O'Hare Station Director. A woman named Angela Voss, who had run the Denver hub for 5 years with an HR record Naomi had spent 2 hours reviewing, would begin in 3 weeks. Her first project would be reading the full complaint history for every gate agent in Terminal 5 and producing a remediation plan for anyone with 3 or more unresolved complaints. When Naomi finished, Philip stood. "We are doing all of this?" he said to the room with the specific weight of a statement rather than a goal. "Not because it's legally advisable, though it is. Not because it's good for our image, though it will be. Because Delia Frazier wrote 7 words on a complaint form, and she was right to write them, and she deserves to be wrong about what she expected." He paused. "We have a chance to make her wrong. We're going to take it." There was no applause. There was something better than applause, the specific weighted silence of people who have understood something and are deciding how to carry it. The consequences moved through the company in the weeks and months that followed, not as a wave but as a slow structural change, the kind that doesn't make headlines because it lives in the details, in the form that gets updated and the protocol that gets certified, and the supervisor who reads a complaint file on a Tuesday afternoon that might previously have been passed to the bottom of the stack. 3 months after the meeting, TAA's passenger satisfaction scores, which had dipped sharply in November and December as the story of Gate K-19 circulated online, began to recover. By spring, they had surpassed their previous record. 6 months after the meeting, 2 other carriers, having watched what TAA had done and having been asked about it by their own boards, formally requested access to the complaint review framework. Naomi's team shared it. There was no fee, no contract. She was not interested in ownership of the framework. She was interested in it working. 8 months after the meeting, Naomi called Delia Frazier. She called from her office alone on a Thursday afternoon in late August, and when Delia Frazier answered and heard who was calling, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, "I thought the voucher was all I was going to get." "It was all you got at the time," Naomi said. "I'm sorry for that. I want to tell you what your complaint produced." And she did. Carefully, specifically, without making it more than it was or less than it was. She told her about the verification protocol and the complaint review threshold and the human supervisor who would now read every complaint that Delia Frazier's 17 counterparts and all the people after them filed, and whose job it would be to make sure the answer was never again a form letter and a closed file. Delia Frazier was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." And then, "Thank you." 2 words. Small. Real. Enough. November again. The same gray quality of light, the same recycled air smell, the same particular loneliness of O'Hare Terminal 5 in the late afternoon. The announcements echoing off the marble, the luggage clattering the city outside the windows going dim at 4 p.m., the way it does in the Midwest in November, as though the light is always in a hurry to leave. Naomi Reeves moved through the concourse with her carry-on. Her dark blazer buttoned the small diamond studs she wore to every arbitration in her ears. She was 45 now, and she moved through the terminal with the same focused stride, the same contained awareness, the same filing away of small observations, a boarding gate running smoothly, a crew interaction that suggested good training, the way the new verification display at the service desk caught the overhead light in a way that made it clearly legible from 20 feet. She noted it with the same quiet care she had always noted things and moved on. She arrived at gate K-19 with 17 minutes to boarding. The gate was busy, but organized lanes clearly marked the boarding process, running with the efficient calm of a well-trained crew. At the podium stood a young man she had not seen before, early 30s, broad-shouldered, a TAA badge with the new design that had been rolled out as part of the operational update. His name tag read Paul O. He looked up when she approached. His smile was genuine and immediate, not performative, not the professional hospitality that has been trained into someone, but the smile of a person who is actually glad to do their job. "Good afternoon," he said, and reached for his scanner. Naomi held out her phone. The scanner read the pass. Green light. One clean beep. He handed her the boarding confirmation, then paused in the way people pause when they are deciding whether to say the next thing. He said it. "Dr. Reeves." She said yes. He said, "I went through the new certification last month." "The protocol training?" "The verification module." He paused, looking for the right words and finding them with more precision than she expected. "I just wanted to say that it matters. It's different now. We know what to do and we know why we're doing it, and we know that management is paying attention." He hesitated one more beat. "Thank you for that." Naomi looked at him for a moment. At his face, the genuine, uncomplicated pride of someone who has been given a clear standard and discovered they can meet it. She thought about what it had cost to produce that standard, about the wall and the bruise and the 31 seconds and the 17 names and Delia Fraser's handwriting pressed harder than she meant to press, about what it meant that a young man at a gate was standing up straighter because someone had decided finally to name what was expected. "Good," she said. And the word was the simplest, truest thing she had said in a year. That's exactly what it's for. She walked to the jet bridge. At the entrance, she paused. Put her hand flat on the wall, the textured drywall, the same surface as a year ago, slightly repainted the seam where two panels met at the corner exactly as it had been. She left her hand there for a moment. The wall had no memory. It was just a surface, just the threshold between a terminal and an aircraft, between where you have been and where you are going. Its power over her had been returned to her a long time ago, and she had spent the year deciding what to do with it, and she had done it. And now it was just a wall. She stepped through. In seat 1. As the lights of Chicago fell away beneath the wings, and the Boeing climbed into the dark November sky. Naomi opened her laptop and found the acquisition file waiting a new contract, a new set of covenants, a building rather than a defense. She read the first page. It was good work, clean and clear, the language of something being made rather than something being protected. She thought about her mother, about Sunday nights at the kitchen table, the iron moving in steady passes over the uniform, the collar perfect, the cuffs straight, the silent patient preparation for a job that took everything you offered and still found ways not to give you the roots you had earned. I had the language, you didn't, Naomi thought. I used it. I'm sorry it took this long, and I'm sorry you never got to see it, and I'm going to keep using it. Somewhere below in a complaint database that no longer received 17 entries and returned 17 vouchers, Delia Fraser's name was no longer just a closed file. It was a reason. The reason a verification call was now a logged requirement. The reason a supervisor now read the complaint before the template response was sent. The reason the next person standing in that line had something behind them that Delia Fraser had not. That was what justice looked like when it was real. Not a headline, not a single moment of accountability, but a name that changed a policy, and a policy that protected the next person in line. The plane climbed. The city disappeared. Naomi turned the page. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to our channel because the fight for dignity is far from over. And the next story we tell might be the one that changes everything.